So for our first presentation of this round of Sustainable Tucson Ambassadors, we're really happy to have James MacAdam, who is the Superintendent of Public Information and Conservation at Tucson Water. He manages the Public Information and Conservation Office, and he has two other colleagues at least who are doing that work with him. Tucson Water is Arizona's second largest water utility. It serves 750,000 customers. His division is responsible for communication, conservation programming, and development of this inspired program called Storm to Shade. It's the city's new green stormwater infrastructure program. And as I understand it, James had a hand in the conceptualization and getting that program articulated and on the ground. So I'm sure he'll tell us about that. He was a native of Maine, but he's lived in Tucson for 20 years. He's raising two young boys. They live near downtown, which means they can walk everywhere they want to go.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invite to Tucson Water, and I'll just share a little bit more about myself. First of all, can you guys hear me okay? So one thing I want to say is, I do have a presentation. I've only got about 10 or a dozen slides, and I actually wanted to, I think some of the most interesting discussion that we have comes from the Q&A. And so what I might do is try to keep my presentation relatively short, 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. And then if there's a desire, I can present some more on other topics, or we can just dive into a Q&A and I can share some resources with you guys.
Now,
so just
James, I'm going to jump in for a second. I think I
please.
have to make you the host so that you can show the, I'm afraid if I make you co-host, that Trace will get bumped off and that'll harm our recording. So I'm going to make you host. Please just remember to remake me a host when we.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so here we go. Okay, now you can share your screen.
All right, thanks. So just very briefly, I grew up in Maine. I came to school in 1999. I went to Prescott College. I studied environmental studies. Wanted to stay, I fell in love. I studied natural history and ecology, and I just fell in love with the desert and the Sky Island ecosystems, and just the the amazing biodiversity and landscapes that we have here. And so I wanted to stay, didn't want to live in Phoenix, was a little too small to stay in Prescott. So I moved to Tucson. And I've worked in the environmental fields pretty much that whole time. And a couple of highlights along the way. I met Trace many years ago. For the year of 2008, I actually volunteered on the Sustainable Tucson core team, and learned so much about, really serious issues presenting our region, and started to think about some of the solutions. I also I took the Sonoran Permaculture class with the Sonoran Permaculture Guild, which I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in sustainability, and I imagine several of you probably already have. I worked for Watershed Management Group for 4 years. And when I so that was doing neighborhood scale rainwater harvesting, leading those programs. That was in 2008 to 2012. And when I started, it was just me and the executive director and one of the founders, Lisa Shipek. And that group has been so successful. But anyway, just in those 4 years, by the time I left, I think we had like 15 full staff and all these programs. So that was an amazing and inspiring thing to be a part of. So past 10 years, I've been at the city of Tucson. I worked for Mayor Jonathan Rothschild as an environmental aide. Worked for the city manager, and for the past 5 years, I've been in my dream job at Tucson Water, and Stuart had already discussed what that is. So I'm going to jump into the content. Enough about me. I am very happy if people want to just jump in with questions along the way. I'll defer to what your guys' group norms are, but I don't have any problem either way. But and so, if it's something that I'm going to cover later, I'll just mention that. All right, so here I go. Okay. Uh-oh. Okay, you can now see my screen, and there you guys are. I'm trying to get my view of you all back. Okay, great. I've become totally addicted to 2 screens and during the COVID time. All right, so just to tee things off, about over the past 10 years, especially in the last 5, our utility has adopted what's called the One Water approach or One Water framework. And that is really just really 2 main things. The one that is the idea that all water has value, and which probably seems intuitive to most of you in the the industry, in the fields of engineering and city government. There's wastewater, it's included in the name, right? Stormwater, those in particular have been perceived as waste products. And so part of this transformation has been, there is no way every form of water is still in that form in one place or the other of the water cycle. And that particularly in our kind of area, stormwater, wastewater, those are some of our greatest untapped assets. And the One Water approach also looks to manage those resources in a more integrated way. We are in the process of just about to launch the primary public engagement phase. We'll start in August and run through the end of the year. Just a really intensive public engagement outreach component of our master planning process. Every 10 to 15 years, we do a large master plan, which helps shape some of the planning of where we're going to go or how to mitigate certain risks, and how to invest over time in certain ways that we're not going to have stranded assets, or that we're preparing for the future as best we can. And the big feature of this round, the last time we did a major update of this master plan was in the mid 2000s, and so we did a minor update in the 2010s. This is our first big total redo, and a huge part of it is the climate element, the drought and shortage on the Colorado River. And so that master planning effort is called One Water, Tucson One Water 2100 master plan. The website is onewatertucson.com. You can sign up for getting updates there, but we'll definitely be directly reaching out to Sustainable Tucson as well. Okay. Next slide. So very briefly, I'm going to go over just what our primary sources of water are. So we have the largest allocation of Colorado River water, the largest municipal allocation of Colorado River water in the state. We have about 144,000 acre feet. Our customers use about 100,000 acre feet every year. And an acre foot, just imagine a football field filled up with a foot of water. And sometimes you'll hear figures of how many families that supplies. It really varies. In Phoenix, it serves a certain number of families. In Tucson, it serves a certain number of families. And it really depends on what kind of housing they live in, what their lifestyle is, et cetera. But we have about 750,000 people that are served in our service area, which goes outside the city of Tucson. We'll see a picture of it in a minute. And in total, we use about 100,000 acre feet of potable water every year. So what we've been doing as we've received that allocation is we take about 1/3, the unused portion of that, and we recharge it. We basically put it in this picture right here is one of our recharge basins west of the Tucson mountains. We put it in big pools, it sinks back into the ground and goes into the aquifer. And over the past several years, we have saved about 500,000 acre feet of Colorado River water in the local aquifers. That is on top of several decades worth of groundwater that we have as sort of like our savings account. So as the Colorado River gets lower and lower, and at some point we will start to see cuts. We can come back to that and talk to that more. We haven't seen any yet. We've actually volunteered to take voluntary cuts. So we're in the process of discussing that with other stakeholders, other users. So a lot of politics there, lots of fun. But realistically, we'll see some potentially very substantial cuts on this. And I'll talk about how that might affect us going forward. Tucson is proud to have one of the earliest and largest, if not the largest, recycled water system in the country. This is our purple pipe system. We take recycled wastewater and use it for landscape irrigation. Most of the large turf that you see in Tucson at schools, at fields, at parks, and golf courses especially, are irrigated with reclaimed water. And that has, I can show what role that has in our portfolio in a minute. And our use of recycled water has diversified in recent years to other areas. Just a note, if you want to build a new golf course in Tucson, it's got to be on reclaimed water. A big element for Tucson Water over the past 10 years has been the implementation, the sort of welcoming of stormwater and rainwater into its water portfolio. In the water utility industry, for the vast majority of its history, water has only been, the only water that has been really thought about is what comes through the water meter, through the pipes. And it has been a transformation in thinking and leadership, both in the industry and at Tucson Water, to think about rainwater as a resource. And so that started with rainwater harvesting rebates, which started in 2010. Well, I've got some facts and figures about that. And we've done, rebated thousands of rainwater harvesting systems, both active cisterns and catching it in the ground, to encourage people to use rainwater as a source of landscape irrigation. But really for us, this is a primary strategy to significantly increase our tree canopy, our urban vegetation, for all of the various benefits that provides, in a way that uses as little potable water as possible. And a big part of that, which I am very proud to have been involved in, is the city created in 2020 a new green stormwater infrastructure program, which provides about $3.5 million a year. It's a pilot program to install new green infrastructure projects and to maintain some of the existing ones out there that, maintenance is such a huge issue with rainwater harvesting, in that you really lose the value of it if you're not constantly maintaining it. And so that's an exciting piece, as we're really trying to professionalize the maintenance of green infrastructure and treat it like infrastructure as opposed to just sort of an amenity. The mainstay for many, many decades, in the 1990s, Tucson was the largest community in North America dependent entirely on groundwater. This is something that's unique. Tucson still to this day is one of the largest groundwater utilities in the world. And even our surface water, our Colorado River water that we import, all turns into groundwater. We don't directly serve any to customers. It's all cycled through our aquifers. And so as a result of a ton of groundwater pumping in the 20th century, local aquifers were depleted hundreds of feet. And so, energy costs go up, the water quality goes down. We started to see the aquifer itself get compressed, so it can't store as much over time. There's fissures in the earth. There's a lot of negative consequences, not the least of which is if you just keep pumping groundwater, you're going to run out at some point. In the late 2000s, in the early 2000s, about 2001, Tucson took its Colorado River allocation, and that did two things. One, it started actually actively bringing extra water to the basin, and it allowed us to stop pumping local groundwater. As a result, in the past 20 years, we've seen significant increases in certain portions of our aquifer. In certain areas, there's still pumping going on, and what this picture shows, the blue areas is, let's see, this is 2000 to 2016. These trends have pretty much continued. You can see the biggest area of groundwater level increase has been out in Avra Valley. That is the primary location where we recharge Colorado River water into the ground. Our central well field, the plus 73 and plus 50 that you see there, those are areas that were the most heavily pumped historically, and those have been the quickest to recover as we have stopped pumping. And you still see on the northwest side, there's a fair amount of groundwater pumping going on, and on the southeast side as well. Most of that northwest side pumping is other water utilities, Oro Valley, Metro Water, Marana. The city, Tucson Water, does some pumping on the southeast side. We're currently in the process of slowly bringing out our infrastructure to be able to serve that with Colorado River water so we can stop pumping out there as well. Okay, we see groundwater now as that's like our savings account. And one of our primary strategies over the next 50, 100 years is when there's Colorado River water available, we use that first, we save what extra we can. In the bad years, we draw on that savings account of groundwater. And in addition to increased conservation, increased development of our recycled water system, increased use of rain and storm water. Here's some history of water use in Tucson over the past 80 years. You can see until about, so what you see is the first 50 years, almost entirely that dark blue groundwater use. The top line, the overall slope, is just the total amount of customer water use. And so you see it peaked right in that really hot period of development in Tucson in about 2005. What you see in about 1985 is that purple. We started our reclaimed water system, and that has remained fairly steady since about 2005. It's been growing a little bit recently. And then the light blue, that's Colorado River water. And for those who have been around in Tucson for a while, there was a huge debacle where Tucson tried serving Colorado River water directly to customers, similar to what they do in Phoenix. And there was a number of missteps and mismanagement that caused the chemistry of the water was different than our local groundwater. We had a situation almost identical to what happened in Flint, Michigan, where they put in a new source of water and the chemistry stripped stuff out of the pipes and sent it into people's homes. Thank God we don't have a lot of lead pipe in our system. And so that was why we didn't have a Flint situation on our hands. Instead, it was a lot of dirty red, brown water. A lot of fixtures were ruined. It was a disaster. But thankfully it was not a public health crisis. So that's that spike. And then almost by accident, two things happened. In the 1960s, the mayor and council purchased a bunch of farmland out in Avra Valley, west of the Tucson Mountains. which created an area where we could recharge a lot of Colorado River water. And then this debacle happened. And so as a result, we moved to that system where we recharge the water into the ground. The aquifer does a lot of natural cleaning and mixing with local groundwater. And so the chemistry is a lot more like our local groundwater coming out. And so that's what you see in the early 2000s is a move to using almost entirely all Colorado River water on an annual basis. And that's why the aquifers are coming up, et cetera. Two other things briefly, there's several plumes of groundwater contamination from industrial areas, including the airport and the old Hughes aircraft area, now Raytheon, that we are treating. And for a long time, we served that treated water to the drinking water system. Now we send that to the Santa Cruz River, and we're going to be sending it into the recycled water system. That is sort of counted separately because it's accounted for separately. It doesn't count against our water rights. And finally, everything else except rainwater harvesting is stuff that is metered and goes through, meters through customers. Rainwater harvesting, we wanted to demonstrate that that is an actual resource for our utility, for our community. And so we have sort of a not to scale, very rough estimation of how rainwater harvesting is starting to be used as a water resource. And I'll be happy to just send over to Stuart this presentation if anybody wants to see it. And so the other thing to know is about, how are we, I'm going to actually go back for just a second. So I said I was going to be really short, but sometimes it's hard to do, but I'm getting close to the end of my slides. What you see from about 2005 to present day is a significant decrease in water use. During that same time, we added about 200,000 people to our service area. So our overall water use decreased almost by a third for residents, while we added 200,000 more people. This is similar to a nationwide trend, but very accentuated in Tucson. And there's a number of different reasons why. Some of it is the way that housing is developed has a lot less landscape area in it. The other is indoor fixtures, like washing machines. And I mean, toilets, there's still some out there that have like multiple gallon, 3 and 4 gallons every time you flush the toilet. And so that has just improved a lot over the years. Also, Tucsonans have an incredible conservation ethic. What you see here is I should have not even included that thing on the right, but it just shows population increase. GPCD is gallons per capita per day. So this is one of the ways that we measure how people are using water, our customers are using water. The light green is our residential customers. So as of 2021, our customers used per person about 77, 78 gallons of water per person per day, which is among the lowest in the country. On our total potable, so this is any of the drinking water that's served, and this includes commercial and industrial and multifamily customers, is 116 gallons per person per day. And the red line includes the potable water plus our reclaimed recycled water. So you see the trend going down. It's starting to flatten a little bit. And this is something that we want. So 2 things about this. This conservation is what has allowed, like if everybody used the same amount of water per person per day that we did in the 80s and 90s, we would not have any extra Colorado River water. We would be using all of it every year. And in the event of taking a cut, we'd be in a much more dire situation. So if we want the economy, the population to grow, which I know is not a, necessarily agreed upon thing, water does not drive that policy as much in Tucson as you might think. That's really more set by policymakers and other factors. If that is to occur, we need to actually keep driving. We need to keep driving per person water use down. And come back to that. And I know, tell me when you want to stop. I think I've got.
Well, James,
Yeah, you want to take a break?
well, we're just coming up on the break. Maybe we could have a couple of questions
Sure.
and then take our 5-minute break. And let's see. I'll have to see who's got a question. Why don't I save the questions and then see if someone else, that triggers someone else as well. So first I thought you said all water supplies come through the aquifer, but then you said actually now we are getting some of our water directly from the Colorado River. So could you clarify?
Yes. All of the water, all of the Colorado River water that we receive comes through the Central Arizona Project Canal. It comes into that canal at Lake Havasu. It travels 300 miles uphill to get here. We're using an enormous amount of energy. And when there's the canal goes on the west side of the Tucson Mountains, we just open a gate and we let that water into these big spreading basins we have in Ivor Valley, and all of that water sinks into the ground. And so it enters the aquifer.
Okay.
And then to recover that, we pump it back up and then serve that to customers. And that's what I mean by all of it goes through the groundwater system.
Does that mean some beneficial filtration by the fact that it's going through the ground, if that somehow helps to purify the water for use, or no?
It does. So yes, they call that, oh man, I just forgot the term, but yes, it is a excellent natural purifier of water. Thankfully, the Colorado River water is already very clean from a chemical pollution standpoint. The main thing about Colorado River water is it is harder, it's saltier than the native groundwater here, and it's getting saltier over time. And so that's something that we see the hard water stains on our faucets and stuff. Some people get water softeners, and that is a thing. That was a big complaint that people had as we transitioned from using just our native groundwater to Colorado River water.
The increased saltiness of it.
Yeah.
Right. And okay, then we got a few questions. How about Marta?
Okay, so I'm really interested in the open water that you talked about on the west of the city, because I've seen it hiking.
The Tucson Mountains.
Yeah, and I've been very curious, like, what is that and what's out there? And my question is, from a very practical level, why is it open to the sun? I'm sure there's a reason, but I've often thought about like evaporation and water loss in that regard. And I'm curious about that. And then piggybacking on the previous question, if the water does go from the Colorado River does go into the groundwater, and I understand the benefits of the purification and filtration, but you mentioned some downsides of pumping in terms of like the, kind of maybe earth stability fissures compacting the groundwater itself, the groundwater ability to hold the water in the future. So I'm wondering if you could speak to both of those aspects.
Sure. So what happens when we in order to get the water to sink in, like the massive volumes of water to sink into that aquifer, you need a very large surface area to get it, because it sinks, relatively slowly. And so how it works is we put in an enormous amount of water, the water starts to sink in, and then once that water actually touches the aquifer, there is a process which I don't fully understand, but it starts flowing a lot faster. It starts recharging very quickly. And as a result, the rate at which we're putting water in and the rate at which it's sinking into the ground, the overall loss to evaporation is very small. Most of the evaporation that has occurred by far is putting it in an open canal along, all along the way to get to us. And that is, so in both cases, that's essentially For us, the evaporation loss is very low. Even though on the CAP, the Central Arizona Project Canal, the evaporation losses are relatively high, it's still not enough for them to justify covering it with something or to put it in a pipe because of the enormous expense associated with that. As far as the compaction and fissures associated with pumping, that happens when you are just removing. What we are doing is we're putting in and we're taking out. And so it's on such a large basis that it's not like we're sucking it down one year and pulling it up the next. It's just sort of overall very steady state. Yeah. So the sort of in the areas that we're no longer pumping or that we're recharging, those things are not getting worse in terms of land fissures and loss of capacity in the aquifer.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How about one from Laura and then Stephen and Trace when we get back after our break? Okay, Laura, can you unmute?
Sorry. James, I'm wondering, given population trends and gallons per customer per day trends and climate change trends, what you think, how you think all that comes together and bodes for efforts to keep streams that historically ran in Tucson either all year or for a fair chunk of the year, efforts to revive those.
Yeah, great question. Two things. One is we have, so a lot of our recycled water that is not used by customers leaves the sewage treatment plants on the northwest side of town and has sort of that's actually primarily an area of town where water historically did not flow. And so what Tucson Water did, the habitat is still great. It's providing habitat, which is amazing. What we did in 2019 is we brought some of our recycled water through our existing system, and we've begun releasing it at where it actually historically did flow, which is right between 29th and 22nd Street towards downtown. And that is an example of one way we can use the water resources that we have to meet multiple goals. And so that's called the Santa Cruz River Heritage Project. Its primary function is actually taking that recycled water and recharging it in our aquifer. Recharging it further downstream, we lost legal access to it. There was sort of a reduced rate of return because there's so much water already down there. Spreading it out, we actually get more bang for our buck in terms of habitat. Obviously, there's a recreational benefit, the social, emotional, spiritual benefit of having water where it historically was in town. There's habitat returning to that area. So that's one example. The other example is that parts of town where water used to run to a large degree were in areas of shallow groundwater. And those areas are very sensitive to groundwater pumping, and they're also very responsive to stopping groundwater pumping. And I think there's a lot more that we can do as a community. And this is not just a Tucson Water thing, because a lot of these are outside of our service area, but in areas like Tanque Verde Creek or Rincon Creek, if we can get people to hopefully incentivize people to hook into our water system and begin using our larger assets where water is pumped from somewhere else, essentially, there can be a lot of rebound in those areas and even some restoration of creeks. I know that's something Watershed Management Group has taken a real leadership area in. Pima Association of Governments were kind of the first people to flag that on a really public level and map those areas. And that's a little bit of low-hanging fruit, honestly, because there's so much like groundwater pumping for like super low efficiency uses like watering horses or, you know, growing a bunch of really lush vegetation. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in that area, even in a very serious climate change scenario, even in a population growth, economic growth scenario. So long answer, but that's kind of how I see that.
Super. Well, how about we take a 5-minute break? My clock says 11:08, so that means 11:13. And then how about Trace and then Stephen's questions and then James, a little more. I think you got a couple more slides.
Yep.
Thank you. Trace, if you could pause the recording, we'll all take our break. Can you do it, Trace?
Go. James, good to see you again. Two fairly quick comments and a question. The first comment is the city's management of our water supplies, I think, is very well done. Recharging water when we have it is, and then using it to decrease central well field pumping is an excellent policy. The second comment is the idea that we should impose conservation on current residents in order to give it away to more people. And therefore, aren't we doing wonderful things? We have half as much water per person as we used to have. That's crazy. That's not good policy. So the question I have is, our aquifers, in my view, are our long-term water supply. We have to put whatever water we have into the ground and then take out no more on average than we put in on average. The question is, what do we know about the ability of Tucson Water to manage that subsurface storage in a renewable fashion? Because if you pump too much out, the ground collapses and you lose the storage. So what do we know about how to manage the ground as our primary water supply?
I think that, you know, I don't know a lot about the mechanics and the hydrology of aquifer management. The compaction or loss of storage in the aquifer is not something that is like a primary concern. You know, even when we were pumping a lot of groundwater and not replenishing it, that was not like the top concern. The top concern was essentially, one, using all the water. Two, as the deeper you go, obviously it takes a lot more energy and resources to get it out, and the water quality goes down. As far as managing groundwater as a resource in a way that, you know, preserves and hopefully enhances the integrity of that system, I think Tucson Water has a lot of experience, has demonstrated that it can do so sustainably as long as the water resources are there, you know, indefinitely. I don't see any degradation of the aquifer occurring, or not aware of any, except where the areas where we're still pumping. And I know that the communities that are still pumping and the portions of Tucson Water Service area where we're still pumping, we are taking action to reduce or eliminate that. particularly on the northwest side there, Marana, Oro Valley, Tucson are all operating and creating additional recharge areas. So that's my answer to that. But really, the health of it and the ability to manage that resource sustainably is determined by the balance of supply and demand.
Could you track down someone at Tucson Water who would know more about that? I'll give you a call then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Super, thank you. And Stephen?
I have to unmute. Sorry. I had a kind of a twofold question with how you work with other agencies. One is a project I became familiar with happening out at Biosphere, where a guy is looking at putting solar panels over water, specifically over canals for CAP. So I wondered if you guys had any involvement with that project at all. The second thing is, how do you interact with, say, someone like Metro? Do you share water?
So to the first question, sometimes there is research that we're participating in that I am not aware of, but I am not aware of us. I am aware of that research. I don't think Tucson Water has a role in that. As you know, U of A has an enormous and, reputable program in several areas of water. We don't participate in it at all. So I don't think we're participating in it. We are aware of it. One of the things that we have done in the past is evaluated the potential to put solar over our reservoirs. We have more than 60 very large reservoirs, just huge tanks. And the cost versus benefit, the resource use versus benefit of that just hasn't penciled out. But I can tell you that we actually have a high-level meeting with TEP next week. So Tucson Water has a very substantial portfolio of solar. Combining it with evaporative loss is not something that we've done a lot of, essentially because the very few open water sources we're managing, the evaporative loss is very low. But it's it's absolutely something that could and probably should be done more.
Sort of a related question then is the pumping stations that you have for within the city and do you handle sewage as well, I assume?
So we don't handle sewage. Pima County, in the 70s or 80s, there was a split where sort of like a negotiation or agreement where Pima County took over managing the sewer system and the city of Tucson took over managing the water system. Pumping, yes. Within the city of Tucson organization, Tucson Water uses more than half of the total energy of the city. And that is mostly pumping out of the ground, moving stuff uphill. And that is on par with just about any Western community, unless they have a big reservoir that they're downstream of. So that is a huge opportunity. It's a huge liability in terms of carbon impact. And, as the grid gets greener, of course, that's a benefit. But I think there's still a lot we can do to improve that situation. One more thing in response to your original question. Yes, we do. It's called wheeling water. So, Vail, Metro Water, Marana, some of the Native American tribes have their own allocations of Colorado River water, but they don't have places where they can recharge it or store it or take it. And so what we do is wheel water to them, which is where we basically charge them the cost of service to take their share of the water, deliver it through our system to them. So that is a cooperative system.
All right, thank you.
James, since in our closing review, we're each going to be thinking of one thing we might like the city or other jurisdiction to do. I would love to hear what are the things that we could do to improve the high energy cost of our water system?
Oof, that is a great question. And that is not an area that the utility has an energy team that is looking at, resiliency, emergency preparedness, efficiency, and renewable portfolio. I think one of the biggest things that we can do, there's a couple of things. One is to invest in upgrading our pumping stations. That is, we have a lot of old inefficient equipment, diesel generators, stuff like that. So there's a lot of area to improve the efficiency of the system. I think probably the best thing that we can do in the so absolutely more renewables. Tucson Water has a huge amount of land out in Ever Valley and even within the city that could also have more renewables sited on that. Another thing that, so I don't really have a good answer, like what's the top thing, but except for this, that every piece of, every drop of water that comes from the Colorado River has an enormous energy footprint associated with it. The CAP is the largest single energy user in the state. The estimate I heard 10, 15 years ago was that it uses enough energy to power 400,000 homes and in a year. And so what we can do on that end is put pressure on the state, on the CAP, that the Groundwater Replenishment District, which is a elected body. We have local representatives to take that into account, to look at the evaporative loss, to look at the energy intensity of it, to look at the sources of energy that are used. And for Tucson Water, for our community, that we treat that drop of water as incredibly precious, and that we ensure that we're using it as many times over as we can, that we're not using it if we don't have to, that we are, there's a big, leaks are a huge thing, both for customers and for the utility. There's a huge amount of area that can be done in that. So all of those areas speak to the efficiency of the system, which is, I would imagine is at least a 10% improvement, maybe probably significantly more, that we can make in our energy intensity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, let's say in the next, 10 minutes, would that be good for you to review anything more that you'd like to present from your slides?
I'd be happy to. So the subjects that I had remaining were, one, a quick review of our conservation programs. And then the other one, which I thought might be of interest, is this Tucson's water service area policy, which is basically what would determine, what are the boundaries of growth. So, I'll leave it up to you guys if, and I'm happy to run over a little bit. I just defer to the group.
That sounds good. If you're willing to stick around when we break into our pairs for some generating of our main points we're taking home, and then any recommendation that any pair would like to make. So you could be there to hear and ramify.
Sure.
So why don't you go till 11:35? We're all yours.
All right. Let's go back to share. Okay. So I might skip some slides to get to. Just real quick, this is from an accounting perspective. This is, last year, total water production, 110,000 acre feet, 86% of that Colorado River water, 2% was that groundwater that we're cleaning and discharging, and the rest was the reclaimed water system. In terms of potable water production, the drinking water system, from an accounting perspective, it's 3% that groundwater and 97% Colorado River water. Very briefly, conservation programs. We have about a $3 to $4 million budget for conservation programs, which is generated from a separate fee on your water bill. It's basically per unit of water that you use on your bill, you're charged a fee for that. And that generates about $3 to $4 million a year. We put a lot of that into education programs in the K-12 schools. We put a lot of that into education of the contracting community to improve water efficient irrigation and landscape. And then we put a lot of that into rebates, customer rebates. By far, the biggest bang for the buck is every time somebody makes their toilet more efficient. You know, it's not very sexy, but we're actually just in the process now of so our goal is to help drive the marketplace to more efficient. We don't just want to reward people for doing the generic thing you do when you go to Home Depot and get a new toilet. Our new standard to get the full rebate is a 1.1 gallon per flush toilet, which is significantly above the more efficient than the 1.6 that you see at Home Depot, or the 1.28, which is the EPA WaterSense certified. So getting a little bit down into the weeds there. We do free audits for customers. We've rebated over 3,000 rainwater and gray water systems. We also take special efforts to ensure that those rebates are going to people in different income brackets. And we're doing a pretty good job of, you know, here's the proportion of people in this lowest income bracket, and our proportion of how many rebates are going to them is, you know, proportional to the population. So I'm going to jump to this because I think this is probably the most interesting for folks. This is on our website as well. If you just Google Tucson Water Service Area. Until 2008, Tucson Water and the city's policy was, if you ask us for water and we can get our system there, we're going to serve water to you. In 2008, after a joint city-county process with a lot of community input, the city made a decision that we would draw a boundary outside of which we would no longer provide water service. And that is, you know, you could certainly argue that it's too big, it's potentially not sustainable for our community, but at least we've got a line. And outside of that line, we will start to see in the coming decades that water will limit growth because the providers in those areas simply don't have the water resources to support growth. Now, depending on the politics of it, you know, the state or, you know, the elected officials may make different decisions to bring water resources to that, depending on the costs and benefits that are perceived by them. Within Tucson, we have a couple of different areas. The dark blue that you see here, and I know it's like terrible scale, but the dark blue is our current where we already serve water. The yellow boundary is the city limits. About a third of our customers are outside of the city limits. We have that light blue, that's called our obligated service area. And so when that line was drawn, that is where we said, if new people come to that area, the majority of which is inside city limits, we will serve that with water. In the pink area, you would have to agree that if the city comes to you, this is outside city limits, and basically what you would have to do to get water services, sign a form that says, if the city wants to annex me, they can annex me. And however, that is one of the very first things that the mayor and council are looking at is this, and have essentially started putting a stop to, is that water for annexation policy. And so that's, I think, you know, Trace, your thing about, are we just going to keep serving more people? We're just going to conserve so we can serve more people. That's something that's very alive and relevant to the mayor and council. And one of the very small steps they've started taking in that direction is the restriction of and greater scrutiny of these, they're called pre-annexation development agreements. The non-expansion areas, basically any other color that you see, is we will not serve. On the fringes of this, there's a policy about, you know, there's tiny little tweaks that can be made, but the intention and the effect of the policy is that it doesn't just keep growing. It's not like we add this area, and then that allows that area. The policy prevents like substantial growth of that area. So that was really all I had to share. Be happy to take any more questions. I can hang out. I've got a hard stop at noon, but I'm happy to hang out until then.
Thank you, James. And hard stop will be easy because our hard stop for our post reflection is at 11:55. What we'll do is break now into pairs again, and each pair will develop a list of 3 items that they're taking home with them. What's a fact, an idea, a major concept, and then report at least one of those to the group. Don't repeat if someone has reported something that you had written down. But equally important, your wish for a policy that the city or other jurisdiction might adopt to serve the greater good and the conservation and replenishment of our water supplies and our stream flows. And if you have a question also to throw in there for James, that'll fill our time quite wonderfully. I'm going to make new groups. I should have kept the old ones just for the sake of. So let's start with Stephen and Richard.
Okay, well, the 2 points that we thought of right away was, first of all, what we didn't quite get a full scope of what Tucson Water's involvement is with the stormwater and landscaping, and how you're working with WMG or Parks and Rec on those. The other was, we'd like to know more about the education programs, and particularly outreach to people who are not responsive to conservation efforts. How do you get them on?
Wow. Okay. You see, James is taking notes for a follow-up. And did you have a recommendation on some policy for the city or larger entity?
I'll let Richard take that one.
Well, I think the cost benefits of so many decisions, to me, seems to be the major issue. So I think we should all become socialists.
Thank you. Okay, Kevin and Laura.
One of the things that stood out for us was the fact that CAP uses enough energy per year to power 400,000 homes. Did we get that right, James?
Yes, he said.
Yes. So that also stood out. I was going to say we didn't get to finish our conversation quite, but that also stood out as an area for possible activism efforts. I realize that's in a sense outside Tucson, but the CAP does, I would assume, have to have some level of responsivity to the various water agencies and communities to which it delivers. So.
Okay.
One thing I was interested in, I mean, for you to upgrade your pumping stations, it's going to require a substantial amount of capital. And that's always a big issue for local governments. And I was thinking maybe CAP could put a surcharge on water. I don't know if they have the authority to do that, if they need to have the legislature approve it, but put that on, and then have a grant loan program where the money that the revenue they generate would go back into the communities to help them make upgrades to their water systems.
Wow. Thank you, Kevin and Laura.
To be sure it's clear, we're talking about 2 levels there. One is the CAP itself, and the other is within Tucson and Tucson Water, the pumping appeal into homes.
Yeah, okay. Really important topics. Marta and Trace.
So Martha, you want to take a
Sure.
little bit?
Well, I can speak to kind of piggybacking on what you all were saying, Laura and Kevin. I mean, it seems to me my takeaway was just, the energy costs and the water loss costs of the transportation network that exists more broadly, but also within Tucson, right? And almost like making that little circle or the cycle of water use and reuse and you know, more like hyper local, making that circuit smaller to save energy costs. And then also part of my thinking on that regard is, you know, it seems to me that we're working within infrastructure, like, you know, municipal buildings and municipal systems that are still using, you know, technology that isn't in alignment with the message that we're trying to get individual people to then adopt in their homes. Do you know what I mean? And it's almost like my dream would be that every municipal building, from schools all the way up, is a model laboratory of what it is that we want individuals to do. Because then ultimately, as we are in those buildings, and many people are daily, whether it's the post office or a school or et cetera, we could be experiencing the ease of those systems. So then it's easier to apply in the home. So whether that's the curb cuts, or whether that's the water harvesting from rainwater, or whether that's a gray water system that's feeding the landscaping around it, to not do it, but then ask people to do it at home seems to be, it's a very individualistic, capitalistic, you know, it's like, oh, individual consumer, take this upon yourself and we'll offer some help. But ultimately, it would be amazing if we were more on a municipal level laboratory and a model for that, for the experience of it.
Neat. Just for the sake of time, Trace, do you want to compliment that? Or is
Well, just briefly, we haven't talked about it, but our maximum theoretical rainfall, harvestable rainfall capacity in Tucson is about 80 billion gallons a year on average. And that's 100,000 acre feet a year more than we theoretically get from CAP. So what we need, in my view, is a policy that says, let's use all we can for rainwatered forest to shade all of Tucson, and then have a dry well network of around 10,000 dry wells to recharge about 10 billion gallons a year of that water. And what I would have loved to ask is what the current thinking is on dry wells, because there are 250,000 throughout the Southwest, and Tucson has been actively opposed to them since the water recall election of 1975.
Wow. These are such good ideas and topics. And by the way, you'll notice that James is speaking of the city modeling. He is modeling one of the ambassadorial skills, which is to be a good listener. I know that you could respond to every one of those things, and we're just going to keep rolling. Christy and Janelyn.
Janelyn, why don't you go first?
I think I'll go first. Well, I think I'm really jazzed that there's this comprehensive one water view, and that we have the website. There's a master plan, and that I'm really looking forward to the public engagement process. I think that's going to be an incredible opportunity.
Thank you, Janelyn.
Yeah, we talked briefly too about being in a different county and being unregulated in Cochise County where I live. But there is an active management initiative on the ballot for the fall. They did pull that off to stop all those dry wells over by Wilcox. We do have a good water-wise education program here through the U of A, but there's also a lot of development, James. And even though maybe it's more energy efficient, it still exceeds in something like we're trying to do, which is to protect the San Pedro River and what water we have. So that's about it.
Thank you both. All right, so that would leave Bridget and Donna.
Yeah, so I think a big thing that stood out to us was just like how good Tucson is at conserving water. I think we would have liked to see a little bit more on like, is that based on like an individual or like the municipal level, and really like better ways on how we can continue to get better at conserving water. And then we were also talking about like going back to really conserving the water that's brought through the canals, and how I think a lot of people would be like really interested, and even if maybe it costs more, like on raising those revenues to really be putting like solar panels on these open bodies of water for evaporation purposes, and just to continuously add to building our renewable infrastructure. So yeah, I don't know if Donna wants to add anything to that, but.
No, I think you got it.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for being so crisp and also so clear with some of your ideas and questions. James, perhaps we need to schedule a follow-up. There's just answering those things and filling out would be a whole other session. I won't pin you down to ask you whether you would agree, but I hope you'll consider that.
I'd be happy to do that. It's fun.
Awesome.
I love talking about this stuff, and these are great points that you came up with, and I have a ton of resources I could love to get you connected with.